If a stranger says yes to your proposal in less than 3 seconds, either he is completely insane, or he already knows something you do not. Emily Carter never imagined those words would one day describe her own life. Her lungs burned as she ran barefoot across the polished stone courtyard of the royal palace, the cool marble cutting against the soles of her feet while frightened breaths escaped faster than she could control them. Behind her, distant voices called her name, but she refused to look back. Looking back had always been the beginning of another argument, another apology she never owed, another promise that tomorrow would somehow be different. It never was. Jason Brooks had once been the man she believed she would spend her life with. Charming smiles, thoughtful gifts, and endless attention had slowly turned into constant questions, unwanted expectations, and a future that seemed to belong entirely to him instead of both of them. When Emily finally gathered enough courage to end the relationship, Jason refused to believe her decision. He insisted she was only confused. He told friends, neighbors, and even complete strangers that she would eventually return. Then he announced a wedding that she had never agreed to. Standing still had stopped being an option. So Emily made the most impossible decision of her life. She pushed open the towering bronze doors leading into the royal hall, where hundreds of nobles, council members, military commanders, and distinguished guests had gathered beneath glittering crystal chandeliers. Conversations filled the magnificent chamber until the sudden sound of the doors echoed across the marble floor. Every voice disappeared. Every face turned toward the young Omega standing alone in the entrance, her ivory dress slightly wrinkled from running, loose strands of blonde hair falling across tear-filled blue eyes. At the far end of the hall, seated upon an ancient silver throne beneath the royal crest, Alpha King Damian Blackwood slowly lifted his gaze. Stories described him as distant, unreadable, and impossible to surprise. Yet even surrounded by the symbols of absolute authority, there was nothing cruel in his expression. Only quiet patience. Emily felt every heartbeat pounding against her chest as she forced herself forward. One step. Then another. The silence became almost unbearable. She stopped only a few feet before the throne, gathered the last fragments of courage she had left, and slowly lowered herself onto one knee. Several nobles gasped. A council elder nearly dropped the scroll in his hands. No common citizen interrupted a royal audience. No young woman had ever done this. Emily looked directly into Damian's silver eyes. "Your Majesty," she said, her voice trembling but clear, "I know this request sounds impossible, but I have nowhere else to turn. Will you marry me?" The entire hall froze. Even the musicians standing near the balcony forgot to breathe. Emily immediately questioned her own sanity. Perhaps guards would escort her outside. Perhaps the king would politely refuse. Perhaps everyone would remember this as the most embarrassing moment in royal history. Damian rose from his throne with calm, measured steps until he stood directly before her. He studied her face for only a moment, as though searching for something far older than fear itself. Then, without consulting the council, without asking a single question, and without the slightest hesitation, he gave an answer that shattered every expectation inside the palace. Yes. The single word rippled through the chamber like thunder wrapped in silence. Shock spread across every face, but Emily barely heard the whispers surrounding her. She could only stare at the man standing before her, unable to understand why the most powerful alpha in the kingdom had accepted the impossible request of a frightened Omega he had supposedly never met. Before she could ask a single question, the enormous bronze doors behind her swung open once again, and a familiar voice echoed across the silent hall. "Emily, what do you think you are doing?" Emily turned slowly toward the familiar voice, and for a brief moment the courage that had carried her across the palace courtyard threatened to disappear. Jason Brooks stood just inside the towering bronze doors, his tailored navy suit immaculate despite the hurried determination on his face. He scanned the silent hall before his eyes settled on Emily kneeling before the Alpha King. Surprise lasted only a heartbeat before it was replaced by a confident smile, the same smile that had once convinced her everything would always be fine. "Emily," he called, his voice calm enough to sound almost reassuring, "everyone has been looking for you. Come home. We can talk about this privately." The nobles exchanged uncertain glances while whispers drifted through the chamber like a passing wind. Emily remained exactly where she was. Weeks earlier she might have apologized simply to end the conversation. Today she felt something different. She felt exhausted from apologizing for decisions that belonged only to her. Before she could answer, Damian Blackwood stepped forward with quiet composure. He did not raise his voice. He did not display anger. He simply stood beside Emily, his presence alone changing the atmosphere inside the hall. Jason offered the Alpha King a respectful bow. "Your Majesty, this is a misunderstanding between two people who have shared a long history. I appreciate your concern, but Emily and I only need a few minutes alone." Damian's silver eyes never left Jason. "If Miss Carter wishes to speak with you, she is free to make that choice." The answer echoed through the chamber with remarkable simplicity. No command. No threat. Only a reminder that the decision belonged to Emily. Jason looked directly at her. "Emily, you know I have never stopped caring about you. You are overwhelmed. Let us leave before this becomes even more embarrassing." Emily slowly rose to her feet, smoothing the wrinkles from her ivory dress with trembling hands. She looked at Jason, searching for the man she had once believed she loved. Instead, she saw someone who still spoke as though every decision could be made for her. She took a slow breath. "I already made my choice." Jason laughed softly, convinced she could not possibly be serious. "You do not even know him." Emily hesitated because part of that statement was true. She barely knew Damian Blackwood. She did not know why he had accepted her impossible request without hesitation. She did not know why his calm presence felt strangely familiar. Yet she knew one important difference. Damian had not asked her to surrender her voice. He had protected it. The silence stretched across the hall until Damian finally turned toward one of the royal attendants waiting nearby. "Prepare the engagement record." Gasps swept through the audience once again. The attendant hurried away while council members exchanged stunned expressions. Emily stared at Damian in disbelief before quietly stepping closer. "Your Majesty," she whispered so only he could hear, "you understand that I only asked because I needed somewhere safe, right?" For the first time, a faint warmth softened his otherwise unreadable expression. "I understand exactly why you asked." Emily searched his face for a trace of uncertainty but found none. "Then why did you say yes?" Damian held her gaze for a long, quiet moment before answering in a voice so gentle that it almost disappeared beneath the silence surrounding them. "Because I have been waiting for you." Emily blinked, convinced she had misunderstood. Waiting for her made no sense. They had never met. Before she could ask another question, Damian calmly turned toward the council as though nothing unusual had been said, leaving Emily standing in the center of the royal hall with one impossible sentence echoing louder than every whisper surrounding her. The palace did not feel like the cold fortress Emily had imagined. The following morning, golden sunlight streamed through towering windows, painting warm patterns across polished marble floors as birds sang from carefully tended gardens beyond the balconies. Every servant she met greeted her with quiet respect, never with the curious stares she expected after yesterday's astonishing announcement. It was as though the entire palace had accepted one simple truth much faster than she had. She was now the future bride of the Alpha King. The thought still felt impossible every time it crossed her mind. Emily wandered through the eastern wing, guided only by curiosity, until she reached a magnificent library that seemed to stretch forever. Floor-to-ceiling shelves held thousands of leather-bound books while elegant wooden ladders rested against carved oak panels. The peaceful scent of old paper and cedar instantly calmed her racing thoughts. For the first time in weeks, she could breathe without feeling that someone might suddenly interrupt her. She carefully removed a thick history book from a shelf, but before she could open it, a familiar voice spoke behind her. "You found my favorite room." Emily turned to see Damien standing quietly near the entrance, dressed in a simple black suit rather than his formal royal attire. Without the crown upon his head, he appeared less like a distant ruler and more like an ordinary man carrying extraordinary responsibility. "I hope I was not intruding," Emily said softly. Damien gave a slight shake of his head. "Nothing inside this palace is forbidden to you." The answer caught her off guard. She had expected rules, restrictions, perhaps even guards assigned to follow her every movement. Instead, Damien simply walked toward one of the tall windows overlooking the gardens. "Have you settled in comfortably?" he asked. Emily smiled faintly. "Everyone has been kind to me. More kind than I expected." Damien looked outside for a long moment before answering. Fear often disappears once people realize they no longer need to pretend. Emily quietly considered those words. Somehow, he always answered questions she had not asked aloud. Before either of them spoke again, a royal attendant entered the library carrying a silver tray with several sealed letters. "Your Majesty, these arrived this morning." Damien thanked him and accepted the correspondence. Emily tried not to look, but one envelope immediately caught her attention. The handwriting across the front was unmistakable. Jason Brooks. Damien noticed her expression before calmly opening the letter. His silver eyes scanned only the first few lines before he folded the paper once more. Without a single change in expression, he placed the unopened remainder back inside its envelope and handed it to another attendant standing nearby. "Archive it with the official records," he said peacefully. "There is no need for a response." Emily blinked in surprise. "You are not even going to read the rest?" Damien looked toward her with the same calm certainty she had begun to recognize. Some letters are written to begin another argument. Silence is often the kindest ending. His words settled gently inside her heart. Jason had always expected another conversation, another explanation, another chance to change her mind. Damien expected nothing from her except honesty. As they continued walking through the endless library together, Emily noticed an old oil painting hanging above a stone fireplace. It showed a young silver maple tree standing alone beneath a brilliant full moon. Something about the image made her stop walking. A strange warmth stirred inside her chest, accompanied by a feeling she could not explain. She had never seen this painting before, yet it felt impossibly familiar. Damien noticed her lingering gaze but remained silent. After several quiet seconds, he finally spoke in an almost thoughtful whisper. "Some places remember us, long before we remember them." Emily slowly looked at him, her heartbeat growing just a little faster as another impossible mystery quietly entered her new life. 3 days later, the royal council assembled beneath the vaulted ceiling of the grand chamber, where sunlight poured through towering stained glass windows and scattered brilliant colors across the polished floor. Representatives from every major pack filled the semicircular rows of carved oak seats, their quiet conversations carrying an unmistakable mixture of curiosity and uncertainty. Emily stood beside Damien near the center of the chamber, her hands folded calmly before her despite the nervous rhythm of her heartbeat. She had learned something during the past few days inside the palace. Courage did not always feel fearless. Sometimes it simply meant remaining where you belonged instead of running away. At the opposite end of the chamber, Jason Brooks stepped forward after receiving permission to address the council. He looked composed and confident, greeting the assembled nobles with practiced courtesy before turning toward the throne. "Your Majesty," he began respectfully, "I appear today not to challenge the crown, but to ask that this engagement be examined fairly." Miss Carter made her proposal during a moment of overwhelming emotional pressure. "I believe she deserves time to reconsider such an extraordinary decision." Several council members exchanged thoughtful glances. A few nodded quietly. Others remained impossible to read. Emily lowered her eyes for only a second before lifting them again. She knew exactly what Jason was doing. He was speaking as though her own judgment could not be trusted, as though every important decision she made required someone else to interpret it for her. Damien listened without interruption, his expression remaining as calm as ever. When Jason finished speaking, the chamber settled into complete silence. Every gaze shifted toward the Alpha King, expecting him to settle the matter with a single royal decree. Instead, Damien slowly rose from his seat and looked toward Emily. "Miss Carter," he said gently, "the council has heard another person's opinion. They have not yet heard yours." Emily looked at him in surprise. He was not answering for her. He was giving her the space to answer for herself. Damien stepped back one pace, placing the center of the chamber entirely in her hands. Emily drew a careful breath and turned toward the council. Although hundreds of eyes rested upon her, she no longer felt as though she were standing alone. "I appreciate everyone's concern," she began, her voice steady despite the emotion in her heart. "It is true that I made my proposal while I was afraid. Fear pushed me through the palace doors. But the words I spoke belonged to me." She glanced briefly toward Jason before continuing. "Ending a relationship does not erase a person's right to choose their own future. I asked the Alpha King to marry me because I believed it was my decision to make. Whether anyone agrees with that decision or not, it remains my decision." The chamber grew so quiet that even the fluttering banners overhead seemed to pause. Jason opened his mouth as though preparing another argument, but Emily spoke once more before he could interrupt. "No one standing here today needs to rescue my voice. I already have one." For several long seconds, no one spoke. Then an elderly councilwoman slowly rose from her seat and placed one hand over her heart. Another representative followed. Soon, one after another, members of the council stood in silent acknowledgement, not because Emily had become the future queen, but because she had claimed ownership of her own choices. Jason lowered his gaze, realizing that persuasion had quietly lost its place against conviction. Damien watched the moment unfold without taking credit for any part of it. As the council formally recognized the engagement, Emily looked toward him with growing confusion and gratitude. He had possessed every royal authority to speak on her behalf, yet he never once attempted to. Instead, he had given her something no title could ever replace. He had trusted her to stand on her own. As the meeting concluded and the council members slowly departed, Damien approached Emily with the faintest hint of a smile. "You spoke exactly as I hoped you would." Emily searched his silver eyes. "You already knew what I was going to say." Damien looked toward the sunlight pouring through the stained glass windows before quietly answering, "I knew you would finally hear your own voice." The palace gradually became less like a place Emily had entered by accident and more like a place quietly inviting her to stay. Each morning revealed another hidden courtyard, another peaceful hallway, another smiling servant who treated her not as a frightened guest but as someone who truly belonged. Even so, Damien's mysterious words lingered in her thoughts wherever she went. He had been waiting for her. The sentence refused to leave her mind because nothing about it made sense. Late one afternoon, unable to ignore her growing curiosity any longer, Emily wandered beyond the formal gardens until she discovered a narrow stone path lined with blooming white roses. The trail curved gently through ancient oak trees before opening into a secluded meadow unlike anywhere else on the palace grounds. At its center stood a magnificent silver maple tree whose shimmering leaves reflected the afternoon sunlight with an almost magical glow. The moment Emily stepped beneath its branches, an unfamiliar warmth spread through her chest. She instinctively reached out and rested her fingertips against the rough bark. A strange feeling settled over her, not fear, not excitement, but the quiet comfort of returning somewhere she had forgotten she once knew. She closed her eyes, listening to the soft rustle of the silver leaves dancing above her. For just an instant, faint laughter seemed to drift through the breeze. It disappeared so quickly that she wondered if her imagination had simply become too active. Most people stop walking when they find this place. Emily turned to discover an elderly woman carrying several weathered books against her chest. Her silver hair was neatly tied behind her head, and gentle wrinkles framed kind gray eyes that seemed to notice far more than they revealed. "I am Eleanor," the woman said with a welcoming smile. "Royal historian and keeper of the palace archives." Emily introduced herself, though it quickly became clear that Eleanor already knew exactly who she was. The historian looked toward the towering maple with unmistakable affection. This tree has watched generations of kings come and go. Every royal child grows up beneath these branches. Emily glanced upward through the shimmering canopy. It feels familiar somehow, but I cannot explain why. Eleanor studied her expression for a thoughtful moment before speaking again. Sometimes our hearts recognize a place long before our memories catch up. Emily felt a chill despite the warm afternoon air. Those words sounded remarkably similar to something Damien had said inside the library. Before she could ask another question, Eleanor carefully opened one of the old books she carried. Inside were detailed paintings of palace ceremonies from decades earlier. Emily slowly turned the delicate pages until one illustration stopped her completely. It showed the very same silver maple tree standing beneath a bright full moon while members of the royal family gathered around it during an ancient celebration. Near the edge of the painting stood a small blonde girl whose face was impossible to distinguish clearly, yet something about the tiny figure made Emily's heartbeat quicken. "Who is she?" Emily asked almost in a whisper. Eleanor looked at the faded illustration before gently closing the book. "That," she replied with a quiet smile, "is one of the few questions history has never answered." Before Emily could continue, footsteps approached along the garden path. Damien emerged from the shade of the surrounding trees, his calm silver eyes meeting hers beneath the shimmering branches. He looked first at Eleanor, then at the closed history book resting in her hands. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Finally, Damien smiled with quiet understanding and said, "It seems the palace has started telling its story before I had the chance to." Emily looked from the mysterious tree to the Alpha King, realizing that every answer she uncovered only led to an even greater mystery waiting just beyond her reach. That evening the palace seemed quieter than ever, as though even the ancient walls were waiting for something that had been delayed for years. A gentle breeze carried the scent of blooming roses through the open corridors while moonlight spilled across the marble floors in soft silver ribbons. Emily found herself returning to the maple tree almost without thinking. She told herself she wanted answers, yet deep inside she suspected she had come back because the place made her feel unexpectedly at peace. The silver leaves shimmered beneath the full moon exactly as they had in the old painting Eleanor had shown her. Damien was already standing beneath the tree, his hands resting behind his back as he gazed upward through the branches. He smiled softly when he heard her footsteps approach. "I wondered if you would come." Emily stopped beside him, looking first at the tree and then at the man whose quiet confidence continued to puzzle her. "Everyone keeps speaking as though this place remembers me," she said. "You do it. Eleanor does it. But nobody will explain why." Damien remained silent for several moments before answering. "Some stories cannot be understood until the right moment. If they are told too early, they become someone else's truth instead of your own." Emily folded her arms gently, unable to hide her frustration. "Then at least tell me one thing. Why were you waiting for me?" Damien looked toward the silver maple, and for the first time since they had met, Emily noticed something remarkably human in his expression. It was not confidence. It was patience shaped by many years of quiet hope. "When I was very young," he began, "the royal seer spoke of a future queen whose greatest strength would not come from power, wealth, or status. She said the future Luna would arrive only after choosing freedom for herself. She also warned that if anyone tried to force destiny, it would disappear." Emily listened without interrupting. The words sounded less like a fairy tale and more like a memory Damien had carried his entire life. "Did you believe the prophecy?" she asked. Damien smiled faintly. "I believe that real love should never be forced, prophecy or not." His answer settled gently between them. Emily thought about every conversation they had shared since entering the palace. He had never asked her to love him. He had never demanded gratitude. He had never even reminded her that she now carried the title of his future bride. Instead, every decision had remained hers to make. That is why you let me answer the council, Emily realized quietly. Damien nodded. A queen who cannot choose for herself would never truly stand beside a king. The breeze stirred the silver leaves overhead, and one delicate leaf drifted slowly to the ground between them. Emily bent down to pick it up, but as her fingers touched its smooth surface, a sudden image flashed through her mind. A little girl laughing beneath this very tree. A kind voice promising that she would always be welcome here. The vision vanished almost as quickly as it appeared, leaving only the echo of unfamiliar happiness. Emily blinked in surprise and looked toward Damien. I saw something. He studied her carefully but did not ask what she had seen. Instead, he simply said, "Then your heart is beginning to remember before your memories do." Emily looked back at the silver maple, her pulse quickening once again. She still could not explain the strange feeling connecting her to this place, to the palace, and somehow even to Damien himself. Yet for the first time since her impossible proposal, she no longer felt as though she had stepped into a stranger's life. She felt as though she had unknowingly returned to a story that had been waiting patiently for her to find it again. The announcement spread across the kingdom before sunrise. Representatives from every major pack arrived at the palace for the formal gathering that would recognize the future Luna before the wedding ceremony. Emily stood beside one of the tall palace windows, watching elegant carriages roll through the front gates one after another. Only a few weeks earlier she had been trying to disappear from a life that no longer felt like her own. Now she was preparing to stand before the entire kingdom. The thought should have terrified her, yet an unexpected calm rested quietly inside her heart. When Damien entered the room, dressed in his formal black royal attire with the silver crest of the crown upon his jacket, he noticed her thoughtful expression immediately. "You still have time to change your mind," he said gently. Emily turned toward him in surprise. "After everything that has happened, you would still let me leave?" Damien answered without hesitation. "I would rather lose a queen than take away someone's freedom." Emily looked into his silver eyes, searching once again for the hidden motive she had expected to find since the day she proposed. There was none. There never had been. She smiled softly, and for the first time since arriving at the palace, the smile reached her eyes. "Then I am exactly where I want to be." A short time later, the grand assembly hall filled with leaders, elders, scholars, and noble families from across the kingdom. Sunlight poured through towering stained glass windows, covering the marble floor with shimmering colors as quiet conversations echoed beneath the vaulted ceiling. Emily and Damien walked into the chamber side by side, greeted by respectful silence. At the front of the gathering stood Jason Brooks. His expression was calm, but the disappointment in his eyes was impossible to ignore. After receiving permission to speak, he faced the assembly with quiet dignity. "I ask for only one final opportunity," he said. "Not to argue with the crown, but to hear Miss Carter answer one question before every witness gathered here today." The council granted the request. Jason slowly turned toward Emily. "If there is even the smallest part of you that believes we could begin again, I will accept any condition you ask of me. I only want to know whether this engagement truly reflects your own heart." The hall became perfectly still. No one interrupted. No one whispered. Every person waited for Emily alone. She looked first at Jason, remembering the years they had shared, the hopes they once carried, and the moment she realized that her future no longer belonged inside that relationship. Then she looked toward Damien. He did not step forward. He did not speak for her. He simply stood beside her, trusting her voice exactly as he always had. Emily drew one slow breath before answering with complete certainty. "I will always appreciate the good memories we shared, and I sincerely hope you find happiness. But my future is no longer behind me." She paused only long enough to let the words settle across the silent chamber. Then she turned fully toward Damien and smiled with peaceful confidence. "I choose my husband." The words echoed through the grand assembly hall with remarkable clarity. No applause followed immediately. Instead, a profound silence filled the room as everyone understood they had just witnessed something greater than a royal engagement. They had witnessed a woman choosing her own future without fear. Jason lowered his head respectfully, accepting the answer he had finally been given. One by one, the representatives of every pack rose from their seats in quiet acknowledgement. Damien looked at Emily with unmistakable pride, not because she had chosen him, but because she had chosen freely. As the assembly formally recognized their union, a gentle breeze drifted through the open windows, carrying with it a single silver maple leaf that floated gracefully across the chamber before coming to rest at Emily's feet, as though the palace itself had quietly welcomed her home. The celebration continued long after the grand assembly ended, but Emily quietly slipped away. Before the music reached its brightest moment, she needed silence more than applause. Her feet carried her almost instinctively back to the silver maple tree, where moonlight filtered gently through the shimmering branches and covered the garden with a peaceful silver glow. The air felt cool and calm, carrying only the soft rustling of leaves that had somehow become more comforting than unfamiliar. As she approached the ancient tree, she noticed Eleanor waiting beside a small stone bench with a carefully wrapped wooden box resting in her hands. The elderly historian smiled warmly when she saw Emily arrive. "His Majesty asked me to give this to you only after today," Eleanor said. Emily accepted the box with quiet curiosity. It was crafted from polished walnut and decorated with a simple silver maple leaf carved into the lid. There were no royal seals, no jewels, nothing that suggested it belonged to a king. When she slowly lifted the lid, she found a neatly folded letter resting beside a delicate silver pendant shaped like a single maple leaf. Her fingers trembled slightly as she unfolded the carefully preserved paper. The handwriting was elegant and unmistakably Damien's. The date written in the corner made her heart skip. The letter had been written more than 20 years earlier. Emily read slowly beneath the quiet glow of the moon. "To the one I may never meet again. If fate is kind, perhaps one day our paths will cross. If it does not happen, I hope your life is still filled with kindness, laughter, and freedom. If another person earns your heart, I will be grateful simply knowing you found happiness. But if destiny ever brings you back to this place, I promise that your future will always belong to you. I will never ask you to choose me. I will only hope that, if you do, it is because your heart has already decided." Emily lowered the letter, unable to speak. There was no demand hidden between the lines. No expectation. No attempt to claim a future that had not yet arrived. It was simply a promise written by someone willing to wait without knowing whether waiting would ever be rewarded. Eleanor looked toward the silver maple with gentle affection. "He came here every year," she said softly. "Sometimes he stayed only a few minutes. Sometimes he remained until sunrise. He never knew whether the prophecy would come true. He simply believed that love should always leave room for choice." Emily looked down at the silver pendant resting inside the box. As she lifted it into her hand, another memory flashed across her mind with startling clarity. She saw herself as a little blonde girl laughing beneath this very tree while a young boy with dark hair carefully placed the same silver pendant into her tiny hands. She heard his cheerful voice saying, "If you ever get lost, this tree will help you find your way back." The memory vanished as quickly as it had appeared, but this time it left behind certainty instead of confusion. Tears gathered gently in Emily's blue eyes, not from sadness but from the overwhelming realization that Damien had never fallen in love with the frightened woman who ran into the royal hall asking for protection. He had simply recognized someone his heart had never truly forgotten. At that moment, quiet footsteps approached along the garden path. Damien stopped a respectful distance away, giving Emily every opportunity to walk away if she wished. Instead, she closed the wooden box, held the silver pendant close to her heart, and looked at him with a smile brighter than any she had ever shared before. For the first time since their impossible beginning, she understood that the greatest gift he had ever offered her was never a palace, a crown, or a kingdom. It had always been the freedom to choose him only when she was ready. The morning of the coronation arrived beneath a cloudless blue sky, and the palace seemed brighter than Emily had ever seen it before. Sunlight reflected from polished marble walls while silver banners danced gently in the breeze, carrying the royal crest above. Thousands of smiling faces gathered across the grand courtyard. Families from every pack had traveled for miles to witness the beginning of a new chapter for the kingdom. Yet despite the magnificent ceremony waiting beyond the palace doors, Emily stood quietly before a tall mirror inside her chamber, fastening the silver maple pendant around her neck. It rested gently above her heart, no longer feeling like an unanswered mystery but like a promise finally fulfilled. A soft knock sounded at the door before Damien entered, dressed in formal royal robes embroidered with silver thread that shimmered beneath the morning light. For a moment neither of them spoke. They simply smiled, sharing the comfortable silence that had gradually replaced every uncertainty between them. Damien noticed the pendant resting against her ivory gown and smiled warmly. "It found its way back to you." Emily touched the delicate maple leaf with her fingertips. "Maybe it was waiting for me, just like someone else was." Damien laughed quietly, the gentle sound carrying more happiness than words ever could. Together they walked through the palace corridors until the towering bronze doors of the coronation hall slowly opened before them. Music filled the magnificent chamber as representatives from every corner of the kingdom rose respectfully to their feet. The long crimson carpet stretched toward the ancient silver throne, where generations of rulers had promised to protect not only the kingdom but also the dignity of every person who called it home. Emily felt the familiar flutter of nervousness, but this time it was quickly replaced by confidence. She was no longer the frightened Omega who had rushed through these same doors searching for somewhere safe. She had discovered her own voice, her own strength, and a future she had chosen freely. When they reached the center of the hall, the High Elder presented the royal crown to Damien. Crafted from polished silver and decorated with delicate maple leaves instead of sharp points, it reflected the values the kingdom wished its rulers to embody. Strength guided by kindness. Authority balanced by compassion. Damien accepted the crown before turning toward Emily. He looked into her blue eyes with the same quiet patience he had shown from the very beginning. "Emily Carter," he said softly enough that she felt the words more than she heard them, "there has never been a single day when I wished to decide your future for you. Every step that brought us here was yours to choose. If today you still wish to stand beside me, it will be the greatest honor of my life." Emily smiled through grateful tears and answered without the slightest hesitation. "I have never been more certain of anything." Damien gently placed the crown upon her head as warm sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, surrounding them in brilliant silver and gold. The entire hall erupted into joyful applause, yet Emily heard only one heartbeat besides her own. She looked toward the open windows just as a gentle breeze carried dozens of silver maple leaves drifting gracefully into the chamber. Laughter spread through the gathered crowd as children reached up to catch the shimmering leaves dancing through the air. Eleanor smiled knowingly from the front row, while even Jason, standing quietly among the guests, offered a respectful nod before turning away with peaceful acceptance. Later that evening, after the celebrations had ended and the palace had grown wonderfully quiet once again, Emily and Damien returned to the ancient silver maple tree where their journey had truly begun. They stood beneath its shimmering branches as the first stars appeared above the kingdom. Emily slipped her hand gently into Damien's, not because destiny demanded it, not because prophecy required it, but because her own heart had finally arrived at the place it had always been free to choose. Beneath the whispering silver leaves, the Alpha King and his queen smiled at one another, knowing that the strongest bond in the world had never been built by power or fate alone, but by patience, trust, kindness, and the simple courage to let love remain a choice.